Alrighty, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about rhetoric, rhetorical narrative, and clash. My name is Nicholas Ostheimer. I don't have an introduction slide, but since this is being recorded, I'll just tell a little bit about myself. I am a rising junior at FAU High School down in South Florida in Palm Beach. I've competed in congressional debate for about 4 years. I've amassed some accomplishments like winning first place at Blue Key, Nova Titan, UK season opener, being the 2022 through 2023 bid leader in TOC bids, third place at states, and a finalist at TOC. So today I'm going to be talking to you about the use of rhetoric in congressional debate and the many different ways you can use it. So first of all, let's answer the question, what is a rhetoric? Does anyone have an answer to this?
Rhetoric is like play on words or maybe like analogies to like describe something.
Okay. Anyone else?
Rhetoric is those things that basically can set you apart from a different debater by making it more memorable in a judge's mind.
All right, good answers. So rhetoric, I think the most apt description is pretty much anything in your speech that is not argumentation, which means that rhetoric can manifest itself in your introduction, in your transitions, in your conclusions, and honestly throughout your entire speech. The point of rhetoric is to appeal to a certain emotion that is relevant to the round and that the judges are feeling, which may make them more inclined to believe your side and to just think that you're a stronger speaker. So, for example, that rhetoric could be funny, it could be dramatic, it could be inspirational. So, why use rhetoric? Congress is honestly a really boring event. You and all your judges are stuck in this room probably for about 2 hours. Everyone gets an individual 3-minute speech to boil down complex legislative proposals. This is your chance to use flowery language and rhetoric to stand out from the rest of your competitors. This is your chance to do often complicated or controversial subjects justice. We often deal with very weighty and impactful topics in congressional debates, which is why rhetoric is your chance to meet that vibe and to meet everyone where they're feeling about that subject, rather than just being a policy-making robot. So here's an overview about what we're going to be talking about in this lecture. We're going to talk about what does good rhetoric look like, talk about rhetorical narrative, rhetorical clash, and then cover all the keys to executing rhetoric well. So first of all, mastering rhetoric. I recommend to each and every one of you to keep a rhetoric doc on hand for the rest of your congressional debate career. I started keeping my rhetoric doc about 2 months ago. It's a very good choice because here you can have a table with every single good line of rhetoric you've ever had. Personally, I organize this in Notion. And what I like to do is I like to paste all the good introductions, good conclusions, good transitions, good jokes, anything I have into this table, give it tags. So if I ever want to search for rhetoric, I can sort by, specific subjects. And I just include some notes about, where the tournament was from and some other keywords. Does anyone do anything like this? Organize their rhetoric in some particular way so they can, keep it on hand? Y'all just keep rhetoric in your speech docs or on your legal pads and find it up when you need it? Yeah. Hey, that's what I did for many, many years. But honestly, this is way more convenient. I recommend that, especially if you're at the start of your career, this is a great way to, if you hear something good, you can add it to your rhetoric doc. If you come up with something really clever and want to use it in the future, you can add it to your rhetoric doc. You completely eliminate the chance of coming up with something really smart, really impactful, and then just losing it on a piece of paper that you accidentally threw away. Any questions about this rhetoric organization? What's up?
Oh, what are you doing it on?
This is on Notion.
Okay.
Okay. Here's my thought process for coming up with rhetoric. Think, what does the round need? So often, just like argumentation, a round full of speakers is often missing a very particular emotional or rhetorical niche. Just like you want to be the person to come up with the most important argument, you want to be the person to be using the most relevant and impactful rhetoric. The way you can do that is read the room. What's missing? If everyone is being super confusing, then you might want to use your rhetoric to emphasize clarity. Keep it short and simple. Use analogies, use metaphors, boil down a complex topic into something that can be described through rhetoric to make it understandable to your judge. Is everyone being super robotic and dispassionate? Then that's your chance to bring some passion, bring some fire to the round. There's always ways you can lighten up a round just by putting your heart and soul into it and displaying your conviction. And of course, if everyone is being super serious, depending on the round, that's your chance to bring some humor in, to break the ice. And a lot of the time, it'll make you stand out super positively to your judges. Of course, this means you're going to be doing a lot of on-the-spot adaptation in terms of rhetoric in round. That's good. In fact, I think almost all of my rhetoric that I ever write is written in round. I have a very hard time coming up with good lines when I'm not in the heat of like an actual round. Does anyone want to weigh in on this? Do you feel the same way? Do you feel you're much better at writing rhetoric outside of round?
Yeah, I've always written rhetoric outside of round. Like I feel like there'd be like a lot of pressure. Like what if you went into a round with like no rhetoric and then like couldn't, think of anything?
Yeah, that's sometimes the scenario I find myself in. And honestly, like there have been moments where I get called on to speak and I still haven't come up with that banger line of rhetoric that usually pops into my head by then. I'm like, oh crap, what rhetoric am I going to use? And then I come up with something like on the way walking there. In fact, I did that in finals for state quals this year. This definitely doesn't apply to everyone, but I think pressure is what makes me funny, what makes me be able to come up with good rhetoric in, passionate or important situations like that. Okay, first of all, let's talk about funny rhetoric. This is not for everyone because being funny is hard. If you are not a funny person outside of a round of congressional debates, I would discourage you from trying to be a funny person inside of congressional debates. I think a very good benchmark for whether your funny rhetoric is actually good rhetoric is to tell your jokes to a non-debate audience. If they really, genuinely, truly laugh at it, it's good funny rhetoric. If they kind of cringe at you, come up with something else, because in the end, remember that most of the time you're going to be presenting to lay judges. If it's some sort of in-joke about debates, about one of the competitors, about some sort of technique or something, it's just not going to hit the mark with parent judges. Coach judges are going to know that. They're probably not going to look upon it as well either. So it may be funny to you, not necessarily funny to the audience you're trying to convince to give you good ranks. So I think here's some like relatively common ways that people try to be funny. First of all, pop culture references. That's a line of rhetoric about the Wu-Tang Clan I use whenever I have a bill that talks a lot about money. I know a lot of people like to use Ice Spice references back in the day when Ice Spice was still a thing. Hey, if it works, it works. Of course, just remember you are treading on thin ice with certain judges when you make these pop culture references. There is a certain degree of professionalism that's expected from you, and you don't want to cross that line. My personal favorite is contextual humor, and I'll get to this later because it kind of ties into rhetorical clash, but it can also do with your surroundings. If you're in a classroom, you can talk about, hey, I'm the teacher, let's learn a lesson about the thing I'm going to be debating about. If you're in a lecture hall, you can't do the exact same thing. If you're in a conference hall, you can't do the exact same thing. Context is funny because it's specific to the situation, and people are more inclined to laugh at something which is unique to the circumstances you were in with them, rather than something that's just funny no matter what. And finally, you can be funny through references to yourself being a congressperson. So there you see a line of rhetoric about reading Green Eggs and Ham and the quote-unquote greatest deliberative body in the world, a reference to Ted Cruz's long filibuster against something or other where he read Green Eggs and Ham. And there I'm poking fun at the Senate's insistence upon inaction and ineptitude through tools like the filibuster. This, coincidentally, was for a bill to abolish the Senate. Does that all make sense? Any questions about this? Great. Here are ways to not be funny. This is an important example from my TOC finals speech of this year about regulating cloud computing services. You're all holding a phone or typing on a computer right now. Have you checked the Wall Street Journal, traded a stock on Robinhood, posted on Instagram, or sent a work message on Slack? I doubt Senator Wilkes has made any plans for the evening on Tinder or Hinge, but if he did so with the help of Amazon Web Services. This may have been received much better in a lower stakes round, whether it's at locals or something like that. I may not have been dropped by my parliamentarian for it. But I got comments from my parliamentarian and 2 or 3 other judges on that panel that this is inappropriate. They're right. You have to meet the vibe of your chamber. If you're in perhaps the most important round, one of the most important tournaments, you don't want to make jokes like this. It can only do you more harm than good. On the other hand, I think a better example of, yes, funny, the type of joke that's going to go well, not compromise your impression of professionalism, is this greatest deliberative body in the world joke about the Senate. Everyone likes to laugh about the American government. You're not being inappropriate. You're just tapping into American apathy and distrust and disaffection with our institutions. There you go. Any questions? Great. Let's talk about dramatic and passionate rhetoric. There are certain topics in congressional debate where if you are not at least somewhat passionate, you'll just seem kind of heartless and it'll reflect poorly on you. Like you can't speak about Saudi Arabian war crimes or Kenyan child labor without at least some conviction, some human passion coming out of your speech. That being said, it's really easy to go overboard and be perceived as too domineering or even quote unquote shrill, quote unquote emotional, which is why it's really important to exercise vocal control and be very conscious of how your rhetoric and how your delivery of this is going to be perceived. You guys are teenagers, so be very wary of voice cracks. Don't take your voice where it can't go, because when your voice cracks in the middle of like the most dramatic and passionate part of your speech, the judges will try not to count it against you, but they will. So here, for example, is a line from TOC semifinals where I talk about the systematic use of solitary confinement and how terrible it is. Any questions about dramatic or passionate rhetoric? Nope. Excellent. Okay, let's move on to talking about rhetorical narrative. Does anyone have any ideas about what this means? What is rhetorical narrative? Not all at once.
Like when you take people through a story for rhetoric, like about your personal life or something else.
Story is a good word. Anyone else? At least 2. I know we can make it.
Oh no, something like maybe personal, I guess.
Okay. Both of you talking about personal rhetorical narrative. That's good. We'll get to that. So rhetorical narrative is about telling a story that ties through the beginning, middle, and end of your speech. The most simplest form of having like some form of rhetorical narrative in your speech is basically just having your conclusion tie back to something you say in the beginning of your speech. So here, for example, is a good example of what I've done for a personal rhetorical narrative. I'm here in the great state of wherever it is I'm competing to represent my hometown of Pompano Beach, Florida. I've come here to say that if Congress keeps failing bills like this, someday I'll step out of my home and the water will be lapping at my feet. And then at the end of the speech, I say, at this point, I have an existential crisis on my way to school every morning as I drive through the puddles that riddle my low-lying neighborhood's roads. One thing is for sure. Your vote today reveals whether Congress would rather pass this bill or leave me submerged. Does anyone have any observations about that rhetorical narrative? Any comments, criticisms, questions? Point being that people forget loose ends. If your introduction and conclusion are unrelated, there is no overarching narrative to the point that you're making in your speech. Sheerly, through force of the human brain, your judges will be more likely to forget what you said or assign less importance to it in their brains. People forget loose ends, they remember closed circles. Rhetorical narrative is how you have that closed circle in your speech, encapsulating everything in a narrative. So we're going to talk about some types of rhetorical narrative. So first of all, let's talk about tension and catharsis. This is a term from basically like screenwriting, script writing. Anyone who's ever written for a TV show is very familiar with the concept of tension into catharsis. So the concept here is you introduce an unresolved conflict, unresolved tension in the beginning of your speech, and you resolve it at the end. So you have your attention-getting device, you introduce some sort of tension, and people are hooked. And you only give them some sort of solution at the very end of it. Think of it like a cliffhanger, where the cliffhanger is, ended at the end of your speech. Then you have problem and solution, which is a very easy to use type of rhetorical narrative because it's a very common format used for argumentation in the first place. So if you've ever organized a speech around the structure, status quo, solution, impact, hey, you can do pretty much the same thing for rhetoric too. What you want to do is you want to introduce your problem through some sort of story, some sort of narrative, something that isn't just straight up argumentation, statistics, or description of the status quo. And then at the end of your speech, you present the bill as either something that makes it worse or makes it better. That's your rhetorical narrative. Third, of course, this also makes sense, and it also kind of ties into this tension and catharsis concept of having some sort of like setup for a punchline at the beginning of your speech, and then giving the punchline at the end. Because people are waiting, oh, there's some sort of joke to be made here, and then you make the joke at the end. That's rhetorical narrative. And of course, fourth and finally, personal narrative. So that's what you saw here in my narrative of like, oh, this is what happens in my life. I live really close to the water, and if it gets any higher, I'm going to be stepping in puddles quite a lot of the time. And that ties back to, let's say, a bill about climate change. You can use this for a carbon tax. You can use this for a climate resilience bill. You can use it for anything like that. Any questions about rhetorical narrative? None? Splendid. Let's talk about rhetorical clash. Does anyone have any ideas what this means? What is rhetorical clash?
I have
maybe. Oh, go ahead.
You can go, Gavin.
I was just gonna say like using someone's rhetoric against them, maybe.
Okay,
Yeah.
good answer.
So like kind of adding on to their rhetoric. So like I've seen this done a lot in round with certain people. I've even seen like you do it. It's kind of like where you interact with like someone's rhetoric and then use like your interaction of their rhetoric to your favor, kind of, so like I don't know, like if someone talks about like cybersecurity or something and they make a reference about being on their phone, like I'm just taking like this is what I saw like you do, and then like you take their rhetoric and you're like, well, I most certainly would not want to expose Senator Khan's messages or something like that. This bill ensures like privacy. I don't know, something like that. Like it's funny to see, but yeah.
Yeah,
That's
rhetorical clash is pretty much exactly that. Engaging with rhetoric that other people have introduced in the round and refuting it, adding on to it, working with it as some sort of material to apparently be engaged. This is an opportunity for you to think on the spot and to use your wit. You can clash with other people's speeches on an argumentative, as well as rhetorical level to illustrate some sort of comparative or to make a point. So for example, you can make dramatic clash, you can make a humorous remark, you can just apply all of the rhetorical methods we've discussed earlier to making a point about someone else's rhetoric in their own speech. So here, for example, I find it ironic that we come up here on our soapbox in fitted suits and power ties advocating for the average Joe, when time and time again, the policy we make has benefited Wall Street at the expense of Main Street. Believe me when I say that Representative Lou's bill is no exception. There's no real humor here, but it's still rhetorical clash because I'm posing Representative Lou's bill as somehow pretending to be something that it isn't. I'm using this rhetoric to clash with another senator or representative. On the other hand, for the example on the right, it's more humorous. And this is a little bit tricky because it imposes a funny hypothetical situation that hasn't actually happened onto the round. This, by the way, was on a sugar tax bill. As a wide-eyed, newly elected senator, I found the glitz and glamour of Washington, D.C. fascinating. But on my drive to and from Capitol Hill every day, I see a billboard with Senator Amu flashing his pearly whites next to a glistening can of Coca-Cola. Quickly, my fascination turned to concern. Being that this was on a sugar tax bill and that Senator Amu was the actual sponsor, the implication is that Senator Amu is not genuine in his attempt to tax sugar. He has something in it for him. Is this always going to work? No. Are your judges always going to appreciate it? No. That's why you have to be careful where you draw the line in terms of what type of rhetorical clash is appropriate, what's too provocative, what's too confrontational, and what's actually funny. Any questions, any comments on this? Okay. So why use rhetorical clash? The answer is you use it for the reason you do anything in congressional debates. You do it to stand out positively. Rhetorical clash is honestly kind of unusual for a couple of reasons. It requires you to have a lot of original thinking on the spot. It's hard to be funny without planning to be funny. It's hard to be dramatic or passionate without having pre-planned to be dramatic or passionate, which is why almost no one does it. It can be really hard to use rhetorical clash in a clever way that ties into your own speech, which is why rhetorical clash makes it seem like you're especially engaged and dynamic, qualities that judges really appreciate in a congressional debater and will reward you for because they know it's hard. So now we're on to the last section. How do I execute rhetoric well? Before we move on, does anyone have any particular techniques, methods, ideas that they want to share with the rest of the lecture for how they do their rhetoric, what they think works well?
I usually put my rhetoric after a piece of evidence, and it usually connect to the piece of evidence. I don't know, if we're talking about maybe China and child labor, I'll have rhetoric about something about that.
Yes, it is very common to insert a line of rhetoric after an impact statistic, for example. So you have the cold hard evidence, and then you have the more humanizing tie back to, hone the rhetorical points of the argument you just made. Anyone else? All right. Then the first thing I have to say is your rhetoric needs to be relevant. Do not, and I repeat, do not use cookie cutter rhetoric. The more your introduction, conclusion, or any other line in your speech could be used for any old bill on the docket, it is going to lose impactfulness and memorability. A lot of the time, this looks like really generic rhetoric about, oh, we're Congress people, we have to be responsible for our constituents. Oh, we have a responsibility to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Generic and uninspired quotations from the Constitution are really common, and judges don't really care about them, which is why your rhetoric should be kept topical, which means your rhetoric should always tie back to something going on in the round in particular. A couple of things that can tie into that are the subject area of the debate. Of course, your rhetoric needs to be relevant to the stuff you're debating about. duh. But it can also be stuff like the location. Like I said, if you're in a classroom, your rhetoric can have something to do with being in a classroom. If you're in an auditorium, it can have something to do with being in an auditorium. If you're in a particular part of the country, you might make some sort of rhetorical appeal to that. Your rhetoric can be topical to what another speaker has said in the form of rhetorical clash. And that being said, anything else that's unique to your circumstances. A lot of the time, we do congressional debate in classrooms, which often have something written on the whiteboards behind which we're speaking. I have definitely done, multiple times, I've definitely made some sort of rhetorical appeal in my speeches relevant to something going on in the room itself, which is, just one of the ways you can tie relevance into the rhetoric you use for the bill you're talking about. Perhaps most importantly, delivery. You should have your rhetoric memorized. You should have your rhetoric memorized. Every time I judge, every time I evaluate a drill in this camp, every time I judge a round for a tournament, anytime I spectate a round, the thing that always gets me to facepalm is people delivering really good, really pre-written rhetoric straight from their pad. And you know what that does? It takes away every shred of personal conviction and investment away from your speech. Yes, you have nice lines, but you don't really seem to believe in them. You don't have them memorized. You don't talk from the soul. You're speaking to your legal pad when you're delivering these like really impactful, really nice lines of rhetoric. Your rhetoric is when you build a personal connection with your audience, and that is just impossible to do if you read the entire thing from your pad. Third, you need to meet the vibe of your chamber. I like to say that Congress is a vibes-based event. It's not like LD, where the quality of your sources and the perfectness of your argumentation is going to get you the ballot. It's not like speech, where they know the entire thing is about performance, and that's what they evaluate you on. Congress has always been the weird mutt between debate and speech, which is why it's a vibes-based event, which is why rhetoric plays such an important role in satisfying both sides of the equation, which is why it's your job to think about what kind of rhetoric would be the most captivating for your chamber. Like I mentioned earlier, does everyone know each other? Is everyone joking around? Is everyone in the chamber nervous and uncertain? Factors like that make an impression on the way your judges feel about the round. They change the environment in which you're debating. That means rhetoric is your opportunity to meet the vibe of your chamber and be what the chamber needs at that point in time. Any questions about this? Great. And finally, also one of my favorites is remember that in Congress, all of you are role-playing representatives and senators. It's really nerdy, but don't be afraid to lean into that aspect for some rhetorical punch. Don't use it for everything. It's really easy to always default to, oh, we have to look out for our constituents, yada, yada, yada. Kind of boring. A lot of people do it. It doesn't make you stand out. I think it verges on being like a cookie cutter rhetoric. But what I would recommend is using this kind of rhetoric when you can really leverage it to make some sort of point about the principles, the authority, or the responsibilities of the legislative body that you are a representative of. That can often tie into, the lines of rhetoric that you want to use in a speech. Does that make sense? Any observations or questions about role-playing as Congress people? Great. And let's talk about the use of language. I think people don't spend enough time caring about how they put their language together in their rhetoric. The way you put your sentences together and the words you use in your rhetoric should be distinctly different from the words you use in the main argumentation of your speech. So you want to pay careful attention to the different types of sentences. And yes, there are classifications. There are simple sentences, compound sentences, complex sentences. I recommend you look up what each of those means, because what I find to be the most impactful for rhetoric is simple sentences, where you have no punctuation except a period. Sentence starts, sentence ends, period. It's very simple, very easy to keep track of. It means you're kind of speaking plainly, which a lot of judges would like to see from their ideal congressperson. It also means you just like remove all chances to be misunderstood, for your phrasing to just be too complicated or too like difficult to understand. Of course, repetition is a really powerful tool. If you're into poetry, like apply some principles of poetry to your rhetoric. It's definitely like the right approach to take when you're trying to make strong rhetorical appeals as someone role-playing as a congressperson. Okay. Oh, this is what Karina was talking about earlier. So here's an example of a couple of principles of rhetoric coming together when it all comes together in a speech. What if your group chat was leaked? What kind of terrible, embarrassing, or hilarious things would be unleashed upon the world? Russian and Chinese hackers may not care about catching you in 4K, but they do care about finding weaknesses in our national security, ransoming away private information, and crashing hospital infrastructure. Suddenly, lives are on the line. Today, you passed this bill to create public-private partnerships to protect our most vulnerable Americans from devastating cyber attacks. And then I go through the body of the speech. Look, even if I could comment on the messages in Representative Khan's favorite group chat, I wouldn't. Thinking about the contents of a teenage boy's iPhone is scary enough. The last thing I need on my conscience on top of that are thousands of preventable American deaths. I couldn't be prouder to pass. I've never more closely saddled the line between funny and serious rhetoric than this. And it worked. This was for NSDA House Quals, and I got first in that round. So here you have the rhetorical clash with Representative Khan. You have the rhetorical narrative from beginning to end of your speech. You have the series of rhetorical questions at the beginning of the speech. You have the reference to being caught in 4K, which is a pop culture reference. You have a direct reference to all of the impacts of the round with lives are on the line, protect our most vulnerable Americans. Last thing I needed on my conscience are thousands of preventable American deaths. Everything comes together. Any questions? We're approaching the end of the lecture, so here are the examples. Let's draw it out with some questions, with some engagement. Nick, how do you come up with your rhetoric? Great question. So I think a really strong like source of inspiration and motivation for a lot of my rhetoric comes from like pop culture, TV shows, and movies. I don't know if any of you have watched The West Wing, but I've definitely directly ripped like lines of rhetoric from political dramas, just because, hey, a lot of them employ professional writers to have good sounding lines about politics. I'm going to borrow some of their literary genius and apply it to my speeches. Any other questions? That was a great question from Nick.
Okay, in this example, right, the conclusion is the last paragraph, right?
Yep.
I'm double check. Okay. So do you find like personally, like I know like that. Okay, wait, let me think about what I'm saying. Like usually my conclusions like summarize a little bit more of my speech, but I think yours right now, obviously it's rhetoric. Like how do you do you think one's better than the other?
I don't think it's a choice between the two. I think summing up your speech at the end of your speech is either a distinct choice you make aside from your rhetoric. Rhetoric at the beginning and end is something you should always have. Whether you sum the content of your speech up before you go into your rhetorical conclusion, I think is a totally separate issue. Personally, I don't really do it anymore. I do something more like that towards the beginning of my speech, where I sum up like the thesis of my argument all up in one paragraph and then go and like spell it all out towards the end. And by the end of it, it like all speaks for itself. It's a well-structured, module all on its own, and the rhetoric can be kind of separated from it. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Nothing? Alrighty. I think this is the last slide. Don't steal other people's rhetoric. At least not 100% directly. People can tell. I've heard so many stories from people competing across the country of how they took this really clever line of rhetoric from someone that they heard in a recording or in a final round that they observed at some points, and they just use it in their own speech. And either the person that they ripped it from happens to be in their round, or one of their teammates happens to be in that round, and it leads to a very tricky scenario. I've been in like the semifinal of a pretty big deal round where someone like raised a protest with the PO and parliamentarian directly after someone's speech that they stole their entire speech. That can literally get you disqualified. And as soon as you start like directly taking other people's rhetoric, you really get on the verge of plagiarism. That being said, your rhetoric is always better when it's an original thought. I don't know if any of you have ever delivered someone else's speech word for word, but you probably notice it's much harder to deliver it and to give it convincingly and passionately than it would be if it were your own speech. It's much easier to express your own words, whether it's argumentation or rhetoric, than it is to express someone else's. Any questions, comments? Nope. Great. Then I have bad news, because that's the end of the presentation, and the last slide is about questions. So does anyone have any final questions, comments, concerns, or observations about rhetoric, rhetorical clash, or rhetorical narrative?
Do you try to have a certain amount of lines of rhetoric like in a speech?
I don't have a formula. I kind of just do as much as is necessary to get my point across, which means that there are some speeches where I have like 15 seconds of an introduction at the beginning, some speeches where it's more like 30 seconds of an introduction at the beginning. I have some speeches where my conclusion like goes on for multiple sentences. I have some speeches where my conclusion is a straight up one-liner that just ties back to my introduction. I don't have a specific formula because I think the rhetoric you use is so dependent on the subject you're debating and the rhetorical message you're trying to get across to your audience. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
All right, great. Well, if you have any questions about rhetoric or anything else, really, you know where to contact me. Thank you very much for coming to this lecture. Oh, what's up? Does anyone have a question?
Yeah, so what is like what do you think is the best kind of like rhetoric to use in like, or not the best, but like the most effective or the most memorable, like rhetorical clash, like dramatic? I don't know.
It's all 100% context dependent.
Gotcha.
Like I said, the purpose of your rhetoric should be to match the vibe of the round and give the round what it has been missing in terms of like rhetorical content. A rhetorical clash, I think, is a great technique to accomplish that because it means you engage with the round itself. You're not just delivering pre-written rhetoric. It has to do very specifically with what has been said, the people in your round, the context of the round itself. I think that's a very strong technique, which is underappreciated and underused. That being said, between funny, dramatic, passionate, inspiring rhetoric, there is nothing that's the best. There are only techniques and categories which may be the best, depending on the actual round that you're in.
All right, thank you.
And of course, it's hard to answer, like, how do you tell what kind of rhetoric needs to be used for the round? I think that has to boil down to a very instinctual process where you need to gauge the vibe of a round. You need to evaluate what kind of rhetoric everyone else is using, what the content of their speech amounts to, the message you personally are trying to get across with your arguments, and you need to think of how and what rhetoric you need to use to, get your point across in the context of that round. Okay, before I conclude, any other questions? Great. Well, thank you for attending this lecture made by Equality in Forensics, a super duper awesome debate organization, which is offering this lecture in a camp and presenting it later on YouTube. So there you can find all of our resources. Thanks for stopping by. End of slideshow. See ya.